The snails had been eating their way through that rice field for 4 straight seasons. Every year, the answer had been the same. Spray earlier, spray again. Raise the water, drain the water, put more people in the field and pick the snails by hand before sunrise. And every year, the bill got bigger. The field sat outside Crowley, Louisiana, 86 acres of flat ground that had been in the Broussard family since the late 1950s. It was good rice ground, heavy soil, reliable water, close enough to the canal that irrigation had never been the problem. The problem was everything living in the water. Apple snails had spread through the lower checks. Broadleaf weeds were filling the shallow spots. Insects were chewing the edges of the young rice plants before the plants had enough height to recover. By the spring of 2021, the worst 12 acres looked like they had been planted twice and eaten 3 times. The first rice stand had come up thin. The second had come up uneven. And what survived looked weak enough that another hard rain might finish it. Nobody who drove past that field saw anything unusual. Rice farmers had pest problems. Pest problems required chemicals. That was the logic. The dealer saw a chemical problem. The crop consultant saw a timing problem. The neighbors saw a field that needed another treatment. They were all looking at the same 12 acres, and they were all asking the same question. What should he spray next? But that was not the question that changed the field. The question that changed it was much simpler. What could live there and eat the problem? If you like stories about ordinary people solving expensive problems with ideas most people stop paying attention to, stay with this one. His name was Daniel Broussard. He was 44 years old in the spring of 2021, and he had been farming rice full-time since he came home from college in 2002. His father, Leonard, still helped during planting and harvest, though help meant something different now than it had 20 years earlier. Leonard no longer climbed into equipment before daylight. He brought parts. He checked water levels. He stood at the edge of fields and noticed things Daniel was too busy to notice. Daniel farmed rice and crawfish on a little over 400 acres. The crawfish helped spread the risk. In a strong year, one enterprise could carry the other. But 2020 had not been a strong year. Fuel had gone up. A pump motor had failed in July. 2 storms had pushed harvest later than he wanted. And the 12 acres on the south side had produced badly enough that he had started thinking of them as a separate problem, not part of the farm. A problem attached to it. He had spent money on molluscicide. He had paid for herbicide. He had hired 2 high school boys to walk the shallow edges with buckets and pick snails. The boys lasted 3 mornings. The snails lasted all summer. Daniel did not think of himself as stubborn. He thought of himself as careful. But there is a point where being careful and repeating the same thing become hard to tell apart. That point came one afternoon in late March. His mother Elaine had driven out to bring him lunch because she still believed a man working near home should not be allowed to eat crackers in a tractor cab and call it a meal. She found him standing at the south field, looking at a drainage ditch full of snail eggs. The egg clusters were bright pink against the concrete. Elaine looked at them. Then she looked at the field, and she said, "Your grandfather would have put ducks in there." Daniel thought she was joking. She was not. Elaine had grown up 10 miles east of there on a smaller rice place. Her father, Marcel Goudry, farmed before chemical programs became as precise or as common as they were now. He kept ducks, not many, usually between 40 and 60, depending on the year. Some were for meat, some were for eggs. Most were there because Marcel believed every animal on a farm should have more than one job. Elaine remembered the ducks moving through flooded rice when she was a girl. They ate insects. They stirred the water. They picked at small weeds. and they cleaned up snails before the snails got large enough to do serious damage. Daniel asked the obvious question. If it worked, why did everybody stop doing it? Elaine shrugged. Because spraying was faster. That was the whole conversation. She handed him a container of rice and sausage, told him not to leave it in the truck, and drove home. Daniel stayed at the ditch. He watched the water for another 10 minutes. Then he noticed something he had seen 100 times without giving it any meaning. A wild duck landed near the levee. It moved through the shallow water, dipped its head twice, and came up with something in its bill. Daniel could not tell whether it was an insect, a seed, or a small snail, but the duck kept looking. That night, he searched for rice duck farming. He expected to find a few old photographs. Instead, he found research papers, extension notes, farmer interviews, and field trials from places where ducks had been used in rice production for generations. Some of the systems were simple. Others were complicated enough to look like a science project. The details varied, but the principle did not. Ducks were not released into a field and left to figure everything out. Timing mattered. Age mattered. Density mattered. The rice plants had to be established strongly enough to survive the ducks moving between them. The ducks had to be young enough to forage actively, but large enough not to become easy prey. They needed clean drinking water, shelter, feed supplementation, and protection at night. Too few ducks, and they would not create enough pressure on the snails and weeds. Too many, and they could damage the rice they were supposed to protect. It was not a trick. It was a management system. That made Daniel take it more seriously. He called the parish extension office the next morning. The agent who answered had heard of integrated rice duck systems, but had never supervised one locally. He told Daniel the same thing 3 different ways. Start small. Measure everything. Do not treat one season as proof of anything. Daniel agreed. He had no interest in turning 86 acres into an experiment. He chose 6 acres in the southwest corner of the worst field. The 6-acre section had 3 advantages. It could be isolated with portable fencing. It had easy access to water. And it contained enough snails and weeds that success or failure would be difficult to misunderstand. He bought 60 khaki Campbell ducklings from a hatchery in Texas. The breed was known for active foraging and egg production. Daniel did not care much about the eggs yet. He wanted birds that moved. The ducklings cost him $4.80 each, including delivery. $288. He wrote the number down. That became a habit. Portable electric netting cost $640. A small solar charger cost $215. He built a night shelter from scrap lumber, roofing panels, and an old utility trailer frame. He could have called the shelter free because most of the material was already on the farm. He did not. He assigned the materials a value of $300. Daniel wanted the numbers to survive an argument, especially an argument with himself. For the first 3 weeks, the ducks stayed in a brooder inside an equipment shed. They needed heat. They needed dry bedding. They needed more attention than Daniel expected. One night, a waterer tipped over and soaked half the bedding. Another morning, 12 ducklings escaped their pen and scattered behind the seed drill. Daniel spent 40 minutes catching them before sunrise. He began to understand why his grandfather had never described ducks as low maintenance. By mid-April, the birds were feathered enough to spend warm days outside. The rice in the 6-acre test section had established and reached a height Daniel believed could tolerate light movement. He waited 4 more days. That was difficult. The snails were already active. Small weeds were visible between the rows. Every instinct he had developed as a modern farmer told him that delay was dangerous. But putting the ducks in too early could damage the stand. The old system and the new system had one thing in common. Both punished bad timing. On April 19th, Daniel opened the portable gate and let the 60 ducks into the rice. Nothing happened. The ducks stood at the entrance. The rice field was open, bright, unfamiliar, and much larger than their brooder. Daniel walked behind them. They moved 3 feet. He moved again. They moved another 3 feet. Then one duck stepped into the shallow water. The others followed. Within 5 minutes, the flock spread into a loose line and began working. Daniel watched for an hour. The ducks pecked at the water surface. They pushed their bills into the mud. They picked insects from the lower rice leaves. They found the first small snail near the edge of a levee. Then another. Then another. Daniel had expected them to eat snails if they came across them. He had not expected them to search. That was the first thing that changed his mind. The second thing happened 3 days later. The ducks had developed a routine. They left the shelter after sunrise, moved toward the warm, shallow water on the east side, then worked slowly across the plot. They did not graze every square foot evenly. Some areas received heavy pressure. Others were barely touched. Daniel adjusted the fencing to narrow the active section. He moved their water station. He added a temporary shade structure near the center of the field so the flock would stop gathering along one edge. The changes worked. Not perfectly, better. On the 5th day, he found 3 rice plants knocked flat near a muddy corner. On the 7th day, a hawk circled the field long enough that Daniel pulled the ducks back into the shelter before noon. On the 9th day, heavy rain raised the water faster than expected, and the ducks spent most of the afternoon swimming instead of foraging. The system was not automatic, it was not peaceful, and it was not the kind of farming where a person could release the animals, take a photograph, and come back at harvest. Daniel checked the flock every morning. He counted the birds every evening. He recorded feed. He recorded losses. He recorded the time he spent moving fence and cleaning waterers. By the end of the 2nd week, he had recorded something else. The small snails were getting harder to find. Daniel had placed 10 simple observation squares through the 6-acre test section before releasing the ducks. Each square covered 10 square feet. On the first count, he found an average of 6.8 juvenile snails per square. 14 days later, the average was 2.1. The number was not scientific enough to publish. It was more than scientific enough to get his attention. The weeds were changing too. The ducks did not eliminate the larger plants. They were not interested in mature weeds with tough stems, but they disturbed young seedlings, ate tender growth, and muddied the surface around new plants. In the duck section, the weed pressure became thinner and less uniform. In the untreated comparison section next to it, the weeds continued filling the spaces between rice rows. The rice itself looked different. Not taller. Not yet. Cleaner. There was more open water visible around the stems. Fewer damaged leaves floated on the surface, and the plants had begun to tiller more evenly. Daniel showed the field to his father. Leonard stood on the levee with both hands in his pockets. He watched the ducks for a while. Then he said, "Your grandpa Guidry used to do this." Daniel looked at him. "You knew?" Leonard nodded. Everybody knew. That answer bothered Daniel more than he expected. If everybody knew, why had nobody suggested it 4 years earlier? But farming does not forget things all at once. It forgets them one decision at a time. A product becomes cheaper. A machine becomes faster. Labor becomes harder to find. A new method replaces an old one. Then a generation passes, and the old method starts sounding strange. By the 4th week, the ducks had gained enough size that Daniel reduced their supplemental feed. He did not remove it. The flock still needed a balanced ration, especially at night. but their consumption dropped by almost 20%, compared with the amount projected for birds kept entirely in confinement. They were finding real nutrition in the field. Snails, insects, tender weeds, seeds, whatever else 60 active ducks could pull from 6 flooded acres. That mattered, because the ducks were not just controlling pests. They were turning pests into body weight. Daniel weighed 12 birds at the beginning of the field period. He marked them with leg bands and weighed them again after 35 days. The average gain was just over 2 pounds per bird. Again, not university data, not a controlled trial, but enough to show that the flock was not struggling through the work. They were growing on it. The crop consultant came out in late May. His name was Aaron Millett, and he had worked with Daniel for 7 years. He was not hostile to the duck idea. He was cautious in the way people become cautious when their advice affects someone else's income. Aaron walked the test section. Then he walked the comparison section. He counted snail damage. He looked at weed density. He pulled several rice plants and examined the roots. He said the duck section showed less feeding damage and lower early weed pressure. He also said 6 acres in one season did not prove the system would scale. Daniel agreed. That was not the important part. The important part was that Aaron did not tell him to spray the test section. They left it alone. At harvest, the 6-acre duck section averaged 184 bushels of rice per acre. The adjacent section averaged 168. Daniel did not claim the ducks created the entire difference. The test section had slightly better water movement. The soil was not identical. A proper comparison would require repeated trials across multiple fields and seasons. But the ducks had not reduced the yield. That was the fear. That was the question the entire experiment had to answer before anything else mattered. The rice survived. The pest damage fell. The weeds became manageable. And the yield held. Then Daniel opened the notebook. The 60 ducklings had cost $288. Brooder feed, bedding, and heat added $346. Field feed added $412. Electric netting and the solar charger totaled $855, though both could be reused. The shelter materials were valued at $300. Daniel calculated 43 hours of labor across the brooder and field period. He valued his time at $22 an hour, $946. Total first-year cost, including reusable equipment and assigned labor, came to $3,147. That number looked bad by itself. So did most first-year equipment purchases. Then he worked through what came back. The duck section avoided 1 molluscicide treatment and 1 herbicide pass. Together, application and product costs would have been about $72 per acre. Across 6 acres, that was $432 avoided. The 16-bushel yield difference, valued at $6.10 per bushel, represented $585.60 in additional gross rice revenue. Daniel wrote that number down, then circled it. He did not count all of it as duck-generated income. He counted half, $292.80. He wanted the calculation to be conservative. At the end of the season, he sold 48 of the ducks to 2 local buyers for $22 each, $1,056. He kept 12 hens. By November, 8 were laying regularly. The family used some eggs and sold the rest from a cooler at the farm shop. The egg income was small, $318 by the end of the year, but it existed. Avoided chemical costs, conservative rice gains, duck sales and egg sales totaled $2,098.80. Against first-year costs, the trial showed a loss of a little over $1,000. Daniel did not hide that. But most of the loss was equipment that would not have to be purchased again. When he removed reusable fencing, the charger, and the shelter from the following year's projected cost, the same 6-acre system showed a positive return. Not enormous, not life-changing, positive. And that calculation still ignored something Daniel could see, but could not price easily. The field had become easier to manage. There were fewer snails laying eggs along the concrete structures. The weed seed pressure appeared lower. The rice stand had closed more evenly. He had spent less time reacting. That mattered on a farm where the expensive problems were often the ones that demanded attention at the worst possible moment. The next spring, Daniel expanded the system from 6 acres to 18. He bought 90 more ducklings and kept the 12 hens from the first year. He changed the layout. Smaller paddocks, better shade, a lighter shelter that could be moved with a four-wheeler. He also changed the release schedule. Instead of putting the whole flock into the rice at once, he introduced them in groups over several days. The birds settled faster. The field received more even pressure, and Daniel spent less time chasing ducks away from the same muddy corner. People noticed. The first person to stop was his neighbor, Travis Hebert. Travis had watched the first-year trial from the county road and said nothing. That was normal. Farmers do not always ask about a new idea while it still has a chance to fail. They wait. They watch. Then they ask after harvest. Travis wanted to know whether the ducks had damaged the rice. Daniel said no. He wanted to know whether they had actually eaten snails. Daniel showed him the count sheets. He wanted to know whether Daniel had made money. Daniel showed him that page too. Not just the good numbers. All of them. Travis studied the notebook and said, "So you lost money proving it?" Daniel said, "I spent money learning it." Travis nodded. That was a distinction he understood. The following year, Travis tried 25 ducks on 2 acres. His results were uneven. The birds stayed too close to the shelter. Weed control was strong near the entrance and weak at the far end. He lost 3 ducks to a raccoon because his night enclosure was not secure enough. But snail damage fell. He tried again the next season with better fencing. The extension agent began receiving calls. Not dozens. 4. Then 6. Mostly from small rice growers and market farmers interested in reducing chemical inputs or adding another product to sell. The agent organized a field morning at Daniel's place in June of 2023. 22 people came. They stood on the levee while the ducks moved through the rice. Daniel explained the system. He did not call it natural farming. He did not call it regenerative. He did not call it revolutionary. He called it another tool. He told them where it had worked. He told them where it had not. He told them that ducks did not eliminate every pest, that predators were a real risk, that labor mattered, and that bad timing could turn a useful animal into a crop problem. He showed them the notebook. That was what people paid attention to. Not the ducks. The numbers. By 2024, Daniel was running a little over 200 ducks across 34 acres in rotating sections. He still used conventional treatments elsewhere on the farm when conditions required them. He was not trying to prove that one system should replace every other system. He was trying to stop paying for problems that another enterprise could consume. The ducks reduced early snail pressure. They suppressed some weeds. They produced meat and eggs. Their movement stirred shallow water and cycled nutrients through the field. They also required fences, feed, shelter, time, and a farmer willing to watch them closely. That last part was the real cost. Watching. Modern agriculture is built to cover ground quickly. The duck system forced Daniel to slow down enough to notice where the water was too deep, where the birds gathered, where weeds started first, and where snail eggs appeared along the edges. The ducks did not just work in the field. They made him look at the field differently. Elaine was 73 when Daniel showed her the third-year numbers. They sat at her kitchen table after supper. He had brought the notebook because he thought she would want to see the costs, the yields, and the duck sales. She listened while he explained the first 6 acres, then the 18, then the 34. He told her about the extension field day. 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 Daniel waited for her to say she was impressed. Instead, she said, "That's about how Daddy did it." Daniel laughed. "No, it isn't. Grandpa didn't have electric fence. He didn't weigh the ducks. He didn't track feed conversion." Elaine shook her head. "I don't mean the equipment." She pushed the notebook back toward him. He had a problem. He looked around the farm. Then he asked what he already had that could do the work. That was the part Daniel had missed. The ducks were not the lesson. The lesson was not that every rice farmer should put ducks in a field. The lesson was that farms used to be built around relationships between things. Animals did more than produce meat. Water did more than irrigate. Weeds were not always waste. Pests were not always something that had to be poisoned. Sometimes they were feed in the wrong place. Sometimes the answer to an expensive problem was already alive. The knowledge had not disappeared. It had not been disproven. It had simply been set aside when another tool became faster. And faster tools are easy to keep using, even after they stop being the cheapest ones. Daniel still keeps the first notebook in the farm office. The cover is stained from wet hands and duck feed. The first page has one question written across the top. What does this actually cost? 3 pages later, another question appears. What else can do the work? That second question saved the South Field, not because it led to a perfect system. It did not. It led to a system Daniel could observe, measure, adjust, and afford. The ducks still go into the rice every spring. Earlier than visitors expect. Later than the snails would prefer. They move through the shallow water in a loose line, searching beneath the leaves and along the muddy edges. The rice grows behind them. The notebook stays open in the office. And a method that once looked old-fashioned is working again. Not because someone invented it, because someone remembered to ask.